In the icy wilderness of the Gulf of Alaska, where relentless storms churn the sea and darkness falls early on winter nights, a harrowing disaster took shape beneath the veil of snow and salt. It was the final hours of New Year's Eve, 2019, a holiday marked by the sudden vanishing of a seasoned fishing vessel and the lives that it carried. What began as a routine journey towards the Bering Sea would end in one of the scariest commercial fishing accidents in recent memory. For Maritime Mishaps, this is a deep dive into the chilling final voyage of the FV Scandies Rose, a story of bitter cold, blinding ice, and a crew's desperate fight for survival. On December 29th, 2019, the crew of the FV Scandies Rose began preparations for their journey from Kodiak, Alaska to the Bering Sea, where the cod pot fishing season would begin on January 1st. The captain, Gary Cobban Jr., and 6 crew members spent the night loading and securing nearly 200 large combination pots, a normal preparation procedure. In addition to these pots, they also stocked the vessel with bait and provisions for the upcoming voyage. By the following day, on December 30th, the crew continued getting the vessel ready for open water. They confirmed that all equipment was secure, including chaining the pot stacks and sealing the hatches. Alarms were tested for functionality, and after completing these tasks, the vessel was moved to a fueling dock, where it was filled with diesel fuel and fresh water. The captain held a safety briefing for the crew, being trained and certified to conduct emergency preparedness drills. During this drill, they reviewed procedures for engine room fires, the locations of life rafts, and the ship's emergency locator beacon. This also included a how-to guide when issuing a distress call over the radio. One crewman even demonstrated how to properly wear an immersion suit. Survivors later described the drill as highly detailed and thorough. The drill was documented, signed by all crew members, and the paperwork was sent to the vessel's management. All systems were go. The crew also discussed the weather forecast for their intended route. They used a popular weather app and listened to continuous updates from the National Weather Service. Just before their departure, the NWS issued gale and heavy freezing spray warnings for the route ahead. According to interviews, Captain Cobban and the crew were fully aware that the conditions would be challenging, but these were crab fishermen, and for them, it was just another day. At 8:35 PM on December 30th, the Scandies Rose left the North Pacific fuel dock with Captain Cobban at the controls. The vessel navigated northeast through the harbour, under the Near Island Bridge, and then veered northwest through the narrow strait between Kodiak and Spruce Island. It then continued westward through Whale Pass, maintaining an average speed between 9 and 10 knots. While at sea and not actively fishing, the crew followed a rotating schedule for managing the ship's navigation. Captain Cobban handled a 6-hour watch, while each of the 6 crew members took 1-hour turns at the helm, with the rotation resetting every 12 hours. Around 2 AM on New Year's Eve, the vessel entered Shelikof Strait, turning to a southwesterly course along the coastline of Kodiak Island. The route would eventually lead them southwest along the Aleutian Chain, through the False Pass, and into the Bering Sea. From 2 to 8 AM, crew members took their turns at the bridge. Survivors told investigators that although they were tired after preparing the vessel, they had been able to get some rest during the voyage. Each watch ended with a check of the engine room to confirm that the systems were operating correctly. But as morning approached, the weather worsened. Waves began striking the starboard bow, and some sea spray was freezing on the gear. One crew member recalled a thin layer of ice forming on the forward pots, and about 2 inches accumulating on the railings. At that time, the vessel remained stable, and the ice buildup was not yet considered dangerous. When 8 AM arrived, Captain Cobban resumed control of the vessel. Then, just after 11 AM, he contacted the fishing vessel Amatuli using the ship's satellite phone. The Amatuli's captain, also the majority owner of the Scandies Rose, had set out days earlier, taking a more southern route due to tidal conditions. He informed Captain Caban that he had anchored the night before to give his crew rest due to worsening weather. During the call, Captain Caban mentioned bitterly cold conditions and reported both light icing and rough seas. By 2 PM, Captain Caban again handed over controls to the rotating watch. For the next 6 hours, crew members maintained a steady course, though the vessel's speed dropped to just 6.5 knots. One survivor described the weather as deteriorating throughout the day, with increasing wind and waves creating heavy spray. Ice accumulation on the vessel had begun to worsen, building up steadily on both the deck and the equipment. For the first time, suspicion began to fester on the Scandies Rose. As evening settled, the crew of the Scandies Rose faced increasingly difficult conditions. Around 7:15 PM, one of the watchstanders woke Captain Caban for his shift. When he arrived on the bridge, the two discussed the worsening weather, the buildup of ice on the vessel's structure and the crab pots, and a noticeable 2-degree list to starboard. They weighed up their options, including slowing the vessel or adjusting their course to reduce ice accumulation caused by this freezing sea spray. The crew member asked whether the rest of the crew should be awakened to break ice from the crab pots using sledgehammers wrapped in nylon. Ultimately, Captain Caban chose to stay on course and maintain their speed, citing the poor weather as too hazardous for deck work. Before leaving the bridge, this crew member surveyed the crab pot stack from the window and noted a significant coating of ice, especially on the starboard side, where he estimated at least 2 inches had built up on the pots and within the webbing. Around 8 PM, Captain Caban began making a series of calls. He first contacted a friend in North Carolina to wish her a Happy New Year. During this conversation, he casually mentioned that his vessel was taking on ice and had developed a list, although his tone was not one of alarm. He also remarked that he intended to find a safe place to wait out the weather. Roughly 15 minutes later, at 8:12 PM, he reached out again to the captain of the Amatuli, a longtime colleague and business partner of the captain. At this point, the Scandies Rose was about 8 miles northeast of Sutwick Island, while the Amatuli was preparing to enter Dutch Harbour. The two captains talked about sea conditions, with the Amatuli captain advising caution. After the tragedy, he told investigators that Captain Gary Caban Jr. was among the most capable mariners he had ever known. Just after 8:30 PM, the Scandies Rose made another call, this time to the captain of the Pacific Sounder, a fellow fisherman who was actively working in the Bering Sea. The captain of the Pacific Sounder recalled that his colleague sounded concerned about the vessel's worsening list that had now reached 20 degrees, and he noted strong winds up to 70 knots from the west. Captain Caban explained that it was too dangerous to send anyone on deck to chop the ice, and that he was trying to maneuver behind Sutwick Island to seek shelter, although he worried about navigating the area's uncharted seabed. Captain Caban also mentioned carrying 195 pots on board, and referenced recently updated stability guidelines. The Pacific Sounder captain then told investigators that hearing the number of pots during those conditions gave him pause, but he believed his friend was confident in the vessel's condition. Their conversation ended around 9:10 PM, when the Pacific Sounder captain went below deck to tend to his generator. By 9:45 PM, navigation data showed the Scandies Rose had turned sharply and was travelling at reduced speed towards a bay on the southern side of Sutwick Island. Shortly afterwards, the Pacific Sounder captain called back. This time, he sensed a shift in his colleague's tone. Captain Caban admitted that the situation had worsened and that the list had grown severe. The captain of the Pacific Sounder later said that he had never heard that level of anxiety in his friend's voice before. Meanwhile, 2 of the survivors from the Scandies Rose were resting in their stateroom beneath the bridge, when the vessel suddenly lurched heavily to starboard. One crew member, startled by the movement, ran to the bridge where he found Captain Caban. When he asked what was happening, the captain responded in distress, quote, I don't know, I think we're sinking," end quote. And yet no alarms were sounded at that time. Soon after, the second survivor arrived and began distributing immersion suits. The rest of the crew joined shortly after. As the vessel listed more dramatically, it became increasingly difficult to move and to gear up. One survivor managed to get his suit halfway on before leaving the bridge through the portside door. The other struggled to finish donning his suit, using the superstructure for support as the deck tilted. The two crew members stayed close together as the vessel continued to roll. One later told investigators that there was no way the vessel could recover from its current state, especially with the heavy load of pots on board. Moments later, the lights went out. This was the make or break moment. Survival was the only objective. At 9:55 p.m, Captain Caban made a mayday call over the emergency frequency, stating clearly, "We are rolling over." He provided the vessel's location before the transmission was lost. Coast Guard responders in Kodiak picked up the call and tried to make contact, but no reply came. One survivor recalled barely hearing a response on the other end, distorted by static. Outside, the two crew members tried to find rope to help their fellow crew members still inside, but the lines were frozen stiff. One more crewman reached the door and managed to put on his immersion suit, but he did not exit the vessel. Eventually, a large wave swept the two survivors off the deck and into the frigid sea. It's unknown whether any other crew members escaped before the vessel went under. The two men were soon separated in the rough 30-foot waves and freezing water. After about 20 minutes, one spotted the light of an inflatable life raft that had automatically deployed as the vessel sank. He swam towards it, climbed in, and then called out for his shipmate. The second survivor heard him and joined him on the raft. It was roughly an hour later when they managed to locate the raft survival kit. Although the waterlogged raft and the bulky suits they were wearing made it hard to access the supplies. They fired off several flares, but no vessels were seen. After spending 4 hours adrift, they noticed what looked like the light of a ship's mast, but it turned out to be a US Coast Guard helicopter. After failing to locate any survivors near the second life raft, the aircraft saw the distinct beam of a flashlight cutting through the night, and they made contact with the two men. At last, hope had finally been found. A few hours before their hope had arrived, at 9:55 p.m. on December 31st, 2019, the US Coast Guard Communication Command in Kodiak, Alaska, received a distress call from the Scandies Rose on a high-frequency radio channel. The message was forwarded to Coast Guard District 17, which then informed Sector Anchorage of the emergency. When further attempts to reach the vessel had failed, the Coast Guard issued an urgent marine information broadcast over both high-frequency and very high-frequency channels, alerting all nearby vessels to be on the lookout and to report any findings. One vessel, the Rough N Ready, anchored about 25 miles from where the Scandies Rose was last located, was contacted via satellite phone. However, they had not received the emergency broadcast and were unable to assist due to hazardous sea conditions and their own limitations. At approximately 11:30 p.m, a Coast Guard MH-60 Jayhawk helicopter took off from Air Station Kodiak to begin their search and rescue operations. The crew faced immediate challenges, including dangerous weather and the remote location, which required extra flight planning and additional fuel. Not long after the helicopter was launched, District 17 redirected the Coast Guard Cutter Mellon, which was on patrol near Dutch Harbour, to head towards the last known location of the vessel. The Mellon estimated it would take 20 hours to arrive, far too long if they wanted to find the stranded fishermen alive. The pilot of the helicopter later testified that he had expected difficult weather, but the actual conditions were far worse than anticipated. The 170-mile flight to the search zone took roughly 2.5 hours, and was described as one of the most demanding missions of the pilot's career. Once on the scene, the aircrew located an empty life raft, and then shortly afterwards discovered a second raft carrying the two surviving crew members of the Scandies Rose. At 2:08 a.m. on January 1st, 2020, the rescue operation began. With the help of a Coast Guard swimmer who had to have his goggles and gear de-iced between extractions, both survivors were hoisted from the life raft and brought aboard the helicopter. Being low on fuel, the aircraft had to return immediately to base, cutting power to onboard heaters to conserve their energy. After landing at Kodiak Air Station, the 2 men were transferred to a hospital, being treated for hypothermia and discharged later that same day. At 3:40 AM on January 1st, 2020, search and rescue informed authorities that the Scandies Rose had gone down, and that while one other crew member had managed to put on an emergency suit, they had not seen anyone else escape. About 20 minutes before this landing, a second MH-60 helicopter had departed Kodiak to continue the search. Based on environmental data from aircraft on the scene, the Coast Guard had generated drift models to estimate where any additional life rafts or survivors might be located. However, a spanner was thrown in the works, as the coordinates transmitted by Captain Caban during his Mayday call did not match those relayed by the rescue helicopter. Once corrected, however, these new coordinates were used to revise the search patterns. The remaining crew, Captain Caban and the 4 crew members, were never found. On May 11th, 2020, the Coast Guard formally acknowledged their deaths by issuing a letter of presumed death in place of death certificates. Following the incident, the survivors confirmed that no one aboard had been using drugs or alcohol. The vessel had strict policies banning these substances, and all crew members were required to pass screenings before they could work. Although regulations required drug and alcohol testing after any serious marine accidents, no alcohol tests were conducted within the required timeframe, and only at-home drug tests were performed, the results of which were not verified by an accredited lab. In the weeks following the sinking of the Scandies Rose, the vessel's owners hired a marine salvage team and a hydrographic survey company to locate the wreck and to document its condition. On February 9th, 2020, the Endurance, operated by Paradigm Marine and a small crew, began their search. By the morning of February 10th, the Endurance reached the area where the Scandies Rose was believed to have gone down. ROV dives were conducted on February 11th and 13th, capturing video footage of the wreck and the surrounding debris. A combination of rough weather and tidal changes limited their access, but the team was still able to inspect the vessel's bottom, stern, and port sides. While reviewing footage of the bridge, investigators noted 2 orange immersion suits that appeared to contain human remains. No attempts were made to retrieve them, and no additional suits or bodies were ever observed. After wrapping up the final ROV dive and facing worsening weather, the Endurance returned to Kodiak. On September 23rd, 2020, NOAA's research vessel Oscar Dyson, responding to a request from the Coast Guard's Marine Board of Investigation, attempted to recover crab pots from the wreck's debris field. However, high seas and poor weather forced the mission to end without success. No other recovery efforts have taken place since. In reference to the tragedy on Lake Superior, the famous Gordon Lightfoot lyrics usually go, "Superior," they said, "never gives up her dead." And it appears the same can be said of the waters of the Bering Sea. Hopefully, the souls of Captain Caban and the lost crew members may rest at peace, their memories and legacy remembered for their bravery.